Now, over the past 2 days at the Standard Bank Top Women Conference, we've been engaging with global thought leaders on gender-responsive programming in times of a global crisis. Topics have ranged from the African continental free trade area's economic opportunities for women to realizing women's work and the definition of human rights and women's rights, as well as the Gen Z population that is reclaiming Africa and the world's future. And with this final panel discussion, we bring it home to the decade of action as we have a conversation with organizations and the women behind them who are setting gender equity in motion. The Gender Agenda, Redefining Equality in the Workplace, topic that guides today's panel discussion. I am Vuyolwethu Dubese, and what a pleasure it is to moderate this, what I believe will be an energizing and critical conversation on the structural, relational, and transformative change required to keep this wheel of gender equity in motion. I am joined by three global leaders who are desked in 3 continents, have worked in Africa and across the diaspora, and are leading global solutions, spearheading gender-responsive programming. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome from the UK, Anne Alaka, the Head of Investment Banking International at Standard Bank. We then travel to the south, in South Africa, to Masana Dinga-Kanga, the Programs Director at Sonke Gender Justice. And we round off our panel discussion with Dr. Rebecca Calder, the Managing Director at Core Global Consulting in Canada. And as I welcome your opening remarks, and Anne, starting with you and passing the digital mic to Masana and Dr. Rebecca, perhaps a response to this she session term that has been dubbed by PwC, and of course looking at the gendered recession and the gendered negative impact that it has had on women in work, and how you've seen it manifest in your respective industries and the continents that you inhabit.
Thanks, Vuyo. I think last year was a tough year for everybody, for women as well. And it's probably not a surprise that the necessary balance of working from home and looking after the family has led to a lot of stress and led to women in particular thinking of how they can actually balance that in the long term, reconsidering their options, and actually how they can manage both work and working at home in one environment. It actually allowed me to reflect on something that was quite pertinent in my career. When my children were young, I used to go to work to rest. And interestingly, when I was speaking to some of my male colleagues, for the first time, they experienced that during the pandemic. The fact that they had to both do their work and support the family and participating in taking care meant they were exhausted by the end of it and delighted to come back to work. But actually, that's a reality of many working mothers. So I'm not surprised that there's an element to the she session. I think in the longer term, though, I would like to see continued progress.
Absolutely. And Masana, I see you nodding vigorously to what Anne was engaging on. Do you share the same thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a single working mother who's also under 35, so quite young, to a very feisty and energetic 6-year-old, I completely relate on, I think, just the psychosocial toll that lockdown took on myself. And that's from a position of relative privilege, in that I had access to an income, access to internet to be able to do my work. But when we begin to politicize the she session, right, and what underlies that, the concept of social reproduction, who is carrying the weight of care work, not just for working fathers, but also for working mothers. How does that relate to migration status? We know, for example, a number of those in the domestic care industry are predominantly foreign migrant women, in a number of our countries, predominantly from the African continent or from former colonies. We know that there is a acute socioeconomic inequality that underpins social reproduction. And so I think the She session really does a good job at capturing the visible sort of employees, those with access to internet, to be able to participate in these broad-based surveys. But there is almost an invisibility that is continued in social reproduction for the women, and I think quite alarming, for the children who then have to reproduce or provide care work for their mothers who are working in the domestic care industries.
And Dr. Rebecca, we are going to unpack this in terms of how we redefine work and what work means. But what has been your experience, I think, even working across the broad range of clients that you service in terms of what the gendered recession or the She session, as it's been dubbed, and how you've engaged with that, or how it's manifested in your field? Well, Dr. Rebecca, you are on mute, I believe.
Sorry, picking up. I was too relaxed. You see, you've lulled us into a false sense of security. I think just picking up on what Masana was talking about. I think that we do work with a broad range of clients at Core Global, and very diverse clients. Everything from private sector clients to foundations to bilaterals to NGOs. And I think there is a much greater focus, a stronger awareness, and a desire to tackle some of the issues that Masana was talking about. And I think for champions, there are people in all of these, different client organizations who've been trying to champion that approach for a long time and not have the voice to do that. But now that I think these issues particularly around informal women in the informal economy and unpaid care and domestic work, it's impossible to ignore these now because people are experiencing them in their own lives. And in a way, it's been a leveler to some extent. And I say that very cautiously because I think, women who've been working in the global north, and men as well, as Anne said, who've had, schools to, very good schools to look after their children and great childcare and nannies and after school clubs. And all of a sudden, all of that was taken away. And I think there was a small sense that people finally understood practically what we've been talking about, theoretically for so long, about the toll of unpaid care and domestic work and the difficulties of women, particularly those working in the informal sector, but not solely, on balancing those different roles. So I've sensed a much more openness from clients to sort of try to think, have the hard conversations and think about how can we do programming and policy differently to account for these disparities, which have been here for so long. As Masana said, the She session is not a new thing. It's just become so much more amplified and visibilized for all of us. So that's what I would add.
Absolutely. And Dr. Rebecca, as you're speaking, I'm reminded that you are a feminist anthropologist. And I wonder how this affects the scale and the weight and even the design of the work that you do at Core Global Consulting, which is a feminist, women-led consultancy practice. And I want to bring in something that Masana had engaged on earlier, which is with one of the objectives that she's definitely bringing into this conversation, and that is around politicizing this conversation, right? And without going into it too much, but we always hear about genderless, but never feminist, women-led, which I think by your design is very intentional and I dare say quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it was a big debate internally with my co-director Emily. When we first launched in December 2019, I mean, we obviously knew we were feminists. We'd been hanging out together and working together for a very long time. But we thought to ourselves, do we lead with this? There weren't a lot of other consultancy firms saying, we're feminist and, we do need to make money to keep our families going. So, was there going to be a trade-off where people are going to just walk away? And I think we just got to the point where we thought, well, we don't care, actually. We're just going to go out there in the world and we're going to present ourselves as feminist, and we're going to attract people, who are excited about that, or, maybe people who don't even really know what that's all about, but are curious. And I think wearing that badge, as a company, I think it both gives you license to challenge your clients. I think a lot of consultancy firms don't challenge their clients, but it gives us license because we're like, well, you knew we were feminist when you hired us. So this is what you get. And you're going to have these hard conversations and it's going to be uncomfortable. And we're here with you all the way to try to figure out how we can make this work for you. So we start wherever our clients are at, even if it's sort of at the gender unaware, and we take it from there. And some are on the cusp of gender transformation, and that's wonderful too. So we meet people where they're at. But I think by going out sort of boldly as feminists, it also gives permission for people to challenge us. And that is scary and wonderful. So what does it look like to be a good feminist? I don't know. It looks like a million different things. And there are feminisms. There isn't feminism. So as I get older, and I've spent a long time in my career, I'm terrified that people will stop challenging me because they'll think that what I'm speaking is, wisdom. And I need that challenge. And I want people to say, hang on a sec, how feminist is that? Or how are you doing that in a feminist way? How are you, sort of internally, not just externally, but what does a feminist consulting contract look like with one of our associates? What does that look like? We're making it up as we go along, and we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we're drawing in all of our friends and colleagues to help us get better at what we do. But I think when you say you're feminist, then that raises the accountability bar, and it makes you want to strive to do better.
So how much, of influence or contribution can the employee have on policy design, like working from home, that impacts how they work, that is gendered, and can be something, that changes overnight in the instance of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Vuyolwethu. That's a great question. And it just brings me back to maybe about 15 years ago in the discourse of gender equality, where we sort of had this push for, we need more women in leadership. More women in leadership, that's what we need. Everybody pushing for sort of gender equality indicators is how many women are in leadership. And then, of course, we see two dynamics emerging. On the one hand, we see that if we say our target is 30% minimum, that actually becomes the maximum target, the sort of pat on our backs. Yes, 30% of our leadership is women and we've done good. Again, not taking into account demographics and what true representation means, right? So that the targets even set by governments and by multilateral bodies are actually minimum, that they're sort of, if you must try to transform, this is the minimum that you must accomplish. The second dynamic is, oh, wait, hang on, we have all of these women in leadership, but the outcomes for well-being, whether it's at a governmental level, so national politics, at a local government level, at a company level, at a civil society level, that the transformation of leadership to include more women does not necessarily result in a transformation of implementation, practice, and organizational culture. And that is because the world of work is fundamentally misogynistic and patriarchal. I'm so energized by young feminists. I was listening to Twitter Spaces. I think that's what it's called. It is called that. I realized I'm old when I stopped. I started not knowing the names of things. And, just listening in on the conversation, like just the acute reflection. And I think even now in 2021, the experience that if a man were to have a picture of his children on the table, it would be perceived as him being a caring, responsible father. But the moment a woman would do it, it would be perceived as, oh, this woman loves her family more than she loves her work. And of course, of course we should. I think, part of the challenge that we face in terms of our policies and governance is, first of all, we have very rudimentary understandings of what it means to have women in leadership, what it means to engage in deep listening, to reflect on power relations and policy and organizational culture, who has to repeat themselves over and over again and get consensus built to be taken as right, and who gets to play devil's advocate, and sort of destabilize the feminist agenda in an organization. Without any consequences, who gets mansplained to, who is taken seriously, who is invited into spaces. I remember when I started as a senior researcher, I entered into an office for a meeting that I was chairing with my intern, who happened to be a white male, and I was asked to make tea. And this is maybe 5 years ago, right? So these things they're actually fundamentally violent. They are, our organizations and our institutions reflect how we value human lives and human bodies, and which bodies have more legitimacy to speak up and occupy space. And for me, that is the real work of creating feminist and gender equal societies, is looking at power and really stripping it to its core and acknowledging privilege and the ways in which it concentrates, right? And gaslights those who poke holes at it. And that for me is a deeply psychosocial exercise that a number of institutions need to be willing to undertake, because you can't question decades and centuries of power and oppression through a policy. You can only question and challenge these through human interactions. And then, of course, the other challenge that we're facing in our organizations is who has to do the work of the teaching. Who has to come in and say, well, actually, that not only is that racist, but that's also particularly misogynistic. And what are the psychosocial or psychological tolls it takes on a person to then have to do that? And what system is around a person to be held as they step forward to say, I have experienced this? Where is the doubt placed? And so for me, one of the things I've said frequently, I'm part of the Racial Equity Index, which is an international index looking at racism in the international development sector. I'm a peer reviewer. One of the things I always recommend institutions look at is when there is that first complaint, how quickly is action taken? That is usually the first indication of how far along in the process you are. So if the person raises a complaint and you still have to, let's talk, maybe you misunderstood, the person was just having a bad day, and there's like series of gaslighting that take place, then usually you know that your policies are just on paper and not actually in practice.
Being in the role that you are, how do you navigate to lead, to transform these ideologies when they sit on your plate that we have, on gender equality in the workplace?
Thanks, Vuyo. I was also listening to Masana's response with great interest, because you took phrases that activists use, and I'm not an activist. I work in the corporate sector. And while to use activist phrases, you talked a lot about my experience. So I'm going to answer your question in two ways, Vuyo. One, around policies and my lived experience, which I think will relate back to a lot of Masana's comments. So if I think back of the last 30 years, there has been significant progress. If I think back to my time as Standard Bank, there has been significant progress, and I recognize that, and I think that is great. The reality is, when we talk about who does the work, when you are sitting in a room and you're the only one who looks like you, or when you're sitting around a table and there are not a lot of other women, you actually do a little bit more work than your male colleagues who believe the same thing you believe. Because it feels different to express it in a room to which you've been invited, and you have been invited. And often you're welcomed in that room. But you carry a sense of, not quite an intruder, but a sense of a pioneer, which in some respects should be something that we all laud, that we think is incredible, that can shift and changes things. But if you are in that position, you're doing a lot more work than other people. So when you talk about how does a how have I navigated it in my career or in Standard Bank? It's by slowly taking an opportunity to ask the questions. I wasn't always a senior exec in the bank, but that isn't the reality of any of us who start working. So in my early career, we had quite a few more women around the table. As you become more and more senior, there are fewer and fewer, but interestingly, far more vocal women. And so I don't know if that is forged through experience or it is merely a sort of survival mechanism. So that's something that I think I ought to reflect on. But finding those opportunities when I would, in a meeting, to reflect back and ask the question. We have had an approach to gender for the last X number of years. What do the stats tell us? What is the level of progress? We're very good, actually, at recruiting women. We're now very good at promoting women in the first few levels of their career. When you move forward several levels and you reflect back, you just don't see the same level or proportionality of women in certain positions. So whilst I think in particular Standard Bank has improved significantly, I think that is true of very, very many corporates. So I take the opportunity to ask the question, if we are good at doing certain things, what stops us being able to carry it through? Because the reality is you promote people who have the experience because that gives them legitimacy. People gain the experience because they are provided with opportunities. So at a relatively junior level, if I provide opportunities to person A rather than person B, within 2 years, the reality is person A is going to be much better placed for the promotion. And I will be doing the right thing in promoting the best person for the role. And I think from a gender perspective, that's something that we can all reflect on, because over the long term, that really does make a difference. And that difference takes place, I think, in the early years of a career, up to about 10, 15 years, because you gain a lot of experience at that time. And that experience gives you the legitimacy to do other things in your career. It enables people to promote you. It enables you to speak up in certain rooms. So I'll probably pause for that. It's certainly asking the questions has been the key thing that I've done. But Musana, just like you, I've been to meetings where I'm leading a meeting and I'm sitting in the back of the room because the assumption is that you're not leading the meeting. It happens to very many of us.
The general consensus around workplace is in formal sectors, right? Where there's a building, where there's internet. But what about, redefining work? How do we engage that? And especially in these emerging markets, where women take up the majority of this force.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. And it goes back to sort of what I led off with around sort of women's work being, invisible and undervalued, and the need to, sort of recognize that work as adding value to economies and societies. So to recognize it, to reward it, to reduce it where possible, and to redistribute it. To redistribute either, from individuals to to the state or the private sector. Or to redistribute it in terms of the household, and that requires a social norm shift. I've been for several years now doing some really interesting work with private sector businesses, be they small sort of social enterprises who are creating time and labor saving devices to benefit women, all the way through to much larger companies. And I think that there is an increasing awareness of things like, should we have a workplace creche? Should we, make sure that there is some sort of parental or family leave, incorporated? But I think there's also some businesses that are starting to now think about sort of shifting the discriminatory gender norms are a break to women being able to enter their value chains and to thrive within those value chains. So, for example, some work that Divine Chocolate is doing in Sao Tome, women were not thriving within the cocoa cooperatives as the company wanted to see them thrive. So when they talked to women and they listened to women, they found that women's unpaid care and domestic work was extremely undervalued. It was very disproportionate. Women were not allowed to attend meetings, weren't benefiting from trainings, and not doing as well as cocoa producers. So they thought, well, what can we do about this? And they started holding workshops with both men and women to start talking about what does the distribution look like of labor within your household, the care and domestic labor distribution. What does women's participation in work look like? How can they benefit more from their participation in work? They even touched on issues like land rights and women's land rights. And what they've slowly started to see is that there's been a shift in attitudes and a greater awareness of women's unpaid care and domestic work, a shift in attitudes, and some early signs that through their support, men are actually starting to take on more of those caring and domestic roles. It's early days. This isn't a big study. They're experimenting, but I love to see big private sector companies like starting to experiment on the edge of that sort of that gender norms. Like, what can we do to support those shifts? But there's also other companies that are doing really interesting things around sort of recognizing and formalizing women's care work, particularly in Latin America, where such a high proportion of the female population is working as domestic carers. There's some really exciting companies, including, women-led companies who are using platforms and apps, technology-based solutions to get women, more formally employed, to make sure that they have access to the social security system, to get these women on payroll, to make sure the contracts are there, so that this work isn't just somebody going and, getting a grubby envelope at the end of the week, which may or may not be what she was expecting to receive, and not having, not being visible to the state as a worker. So I think this is really exciting as well. So I'm excited about what the private sector is doing in this space around recognizing, reducing, rewarding, and redistributing care and domestic work. And just about to start a big research project, a 2.5-year research project with a range of fantastic Global South research partners, and to look at care and domestic work and market-based solutions to that. So I'm very excited about that.
I'm going to move on to Masana, and I think still keeping it within the theme of gender justice, and the structures that really influence how we work. And I want us to think about the future of work, right? When we're talking about structural considerations that should be kept in mind in business or as business, large to small, profit, non-profit, really the governance of how we are thinking about re-engineering how the future of work should be designed.
Thanks, Vuyolwethu. I mean, so I must say, when I received the invitation to this conference, I was quite surprised. I mean, I am a very cautious, I might say quite scandalously anti-growth activist. I do believe that the costs of economic expansion are killing and upending the very things that we're talking about in our panel today. I just when I think about my feminist economics, so I'm a feminist economist. When I think about my feminist economics as a young Black queer woman in South Africa, which is an economy built on mining extraction and the migrant labor system, which undid much of the social fabric of our country, resulted in high levels of transmission of HIV/AIDS, high levels of tuberculosis transmission, which is drug resistant, as we all know, the high levels of domestic violence, and the ways in which in South Africa all of the inequalities that we witness globally intersect into one space to create a fundamentally toxic and frightening condition to raise a young Black child who is a female child. then I get a bit disparaged. When I think of the environmental activists who are women, there was an elderly woman killed in 2018 in Mpumalanga for questioning the expansion of open mines in her community, who was killed. The environmental degradation. I don't think the structures are necessarily organizational, if that makes sense. I think we are reckoning with the world we want to inherit, the world we want to leave for the next generation. I remember Arundhati Roy writing at the beginning of the pandemic that she had hoped that this would be almost the opportunity for a new normal, sort of the pandemic as a portal to transport us into new imaginations of what it means to work and build and create societies that are inclusive and that radically reject all of the isms that kill and hurt us, right? And much like with the financial crisis of the 2007s and 8s, we see that instead power has consolidated itself and wealth has consolidated itself. And there is a very unique characteristic to the top 10 wealthiest people in this world that is not shared amongst any of us on this panel. I'm trying to be quite politically correct, lest you switch off my mic, but I don't think you would do that. And the truth is, when we are imagining our institutions as holding spaces, when we're thinking of our employees as full beings, as whether they are women, mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, when we're thinking of social reproduction, those who are gender non-conforming, how they appear, when we're thinking of people who are reproducing us, whether it be domestic workers, when we're thinking of CEOs and leadership and the demographic distribution of those people, there is a question that is bigger than those sort of what appear to be organization-specific questions, which is what world has created the scenario where these are the things that we have to grapple with. How has power over time consolidated itself to create economies that can push vulnerability in global value chains onto the most vulnerable, or predominantly women of color? How have we organized our companies to chase bottom lines, right, at the expense of human life, pharmaceuticals? How do we then, in our collective feminisms, right, in our collective solidarity, push internally and externally and begin to embody that? That, for me, is the real structural question. The truth is, until our economies work for all, right, until they consider the environment, the children, the invisible, the homeless, those living with disabilities, with mental health disabilities, those on different spectrums of their sexual orientations or gender identities, women, people of color, until we build economies that can hold space for everyone to thrive, the work that we're doing internally is sort of chipping away at a larger problem. And so my challenge then is I challenge the corporates and the government actors who have sent me emails about this conference as well, to push for universal basic income grants, to push for social protection, to push for equitable access to healthcare services and education. So that when we talk about gender equality and the girl child being able to take up these opportunities, it's not that this is a miracle that in the context of great suffering, a Black girl can rise. And we all say, wow, she studied by candlelight. Look, she got 6 A's. It's a miracle. That should not be the norm for our society. And the provision of basic income grants and social services is at least one clear policy commitment that will make that a reality.
What kind of leader will it take to obtain this gender action that we require? And what is the best way that as civil society, as employees, that we can support these leaders to champion their efforts? And I promise that it's at our discretion with the thousands of women and men who are tuning into this discussion.
Thanks, Fuyo. And I'm so glad that Musana referred to Arundhati Roy's essay at the beginning of the pandemic. For those who haven't read it, please go ahead and read it. It really was powerful. And when she talks about imagining, I can directly refer to that when we're talking about the sort of leader that we do need. So it is people who have the courage to imagine and then to be consistent in applying the policies and the spirit of the policies in their daily work. I have rarely come across policies that deliberately, overtly discriminate. But if we have the courage to actually implement things in the way in which it is intended, then I think we'll be talking about the sort of leaders that we require. When we talk about the gender lens at the moment, when we talk about gender equity, there is a challenge sometimes around gender equity vis-a-vis discrimination. And I think leaders have to have the courage to avoid trying to equate the two. It's not the same piece of string. And then just the resilience and the discipline to do it every single day. Change comes when we build the muscle, when we develop the habit of doing the things that we say we're going to do. And much in the same way as the way we exercise to change our bodies, we must exercise to change our institutions.
Dr. Rebecca, I'll start with you. To redefine equality in the workplace in a post-pandemic world looks like?
It looks like everything that Anne and Masana have talked about. And I'm going to shamelessly steal from some of their just brilliant ideas. It does mean that setting a new normal, but that's not a passive exercise. It's an active, conscious, political exercise. Normal means norms, and norms have to be practiced. They are the rules that are the invisible rules that we put into place. And I loved what Anne said about policies. She's rarely seen a discriminatory policy, yet there's so much discrimination. It's because those are the hidden rules. We need to be more aware. We need to be more alive to those, and we need to challenge them and change them every day and live by the rules that we want to see, reproduced out there in the world, in all of the work that we do, 24/7.
I love that. Active, conscious, political exercise, and something that we definitely have to be at work to keep this wheel in motion. Masana, to redefine equality in the workplace in a post-pandemic world looks like?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm not going to lie. I think I'm getting stuck on imagination here. I think, at an organizational level, it looks like embodying the very same mission and agenda, or the CSI statements, the corporate social investment statements that we put out, embodying those very key policies, vision, mission statements in practice. And then at a broader level, I think it's being unafraid to look at the state of the world as it is at the moment. And imagine then, if we were to continue on this trajectory, where we would be in 20 years. And if we were to alter how we envision and imagine our economies and our institutions from a comprehensive equality perspective, looking at power and different identity markers, where we could be if we just began to shift what drives our economies and our priorities. That for me is a broad sort of work environment in the world. So I work in the world that I would hope for. Thank you.
To embody these impact statements, and I think unlocking this tool, very, very powerful tool of imagination, and to redefine equality in the workplace in a post-pandemic world looks like.
I really can't finish the sentence in a nice, neat way, which is what I prefer to do. I'll say it's a workplace that takes advantage of all we have learned during the pandemic. So what I've observed during the pandemic is people being far more comfortable to refer to vulnerability. We all always felt it, but the fact that it was people were comfortable and it was accepted, and then we continued to, well, we actually accelerated the implementation and the culture of working that acknowledged that. So a post-pandemic world for me will take that, not just take into account, but will continue to live that because we have been living it. And I think we're at the cusp of either continuing or reverting to where we were and then trying to grow from there. So ideally, I'd like us to take advantage of the fact that we've had to accelerate certain learnings. And in a post-pandemic world, because we talk more about vulnerability, I think it is then more inclusive because people have felt alone. There's nothing like feeling alone to empathize with those who are alone in a room. But that's what I'd love to see.
Absolutely. Taking this advantage of what I like to call meal, right? And being nutritious and monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning so that we could live this opportunity for accelerated growth and imagination and innovation, which I think was just an incredible conversation. And thank you so much for this energizing, this robust conversation of action. A huge thank you to our panelists and Alika, the head of Investment Banking International at Standard Bank, Masana Dinga Kanga, the programs director at Sonke Gender Justice, and Dr. Rebecca Calder, the managing director at Core Global Consulting. It's back to you in the studio.
Dinner time. Not without the farm. Not without water, fertile ground, or machines to plow it. Not without safekeeping, distribution, and a top-up every now and then. Not without the wholesaler, the retailer, or the bank that backs them all. Dinner time. Not without business.